if you're going to be an independent creator and you're not going to have like some grow and scale up and become some big thing or whatever, you need 1,000 true fans. And I didn't invent that. People can go Google that. But if you have, in theory, 1,000 people on the planet who really care about what you do and will buy your stuff, and you put out $100 worth of stuff each year, you can make a living off of that. And that has been proven true. But it can be a small group of people that sustain you. And then the goal is to really stay true to what those people are interested in, the value that you're bringing to those people, rather than trying to like grow it.
Welcome back to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. My name is Reika and I am your host. If you are a new listener, welcome to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. And if you are a returning listener, welcome back. So this is a podcast where I get to interview full-time yoga teachers from across the world to share their journey of how they are making their passion and love into a career. It's not easy navigating the world of yoga as a full-time yoga teacher because there's no blueprint set up for us. There's no path that is laid out for us compared to if you go to school to become a nurse or a PT or a doctor or a therapist. There's outline of a path that you can take, that you need to complete to get to the next step, And that's just not how it is in the yoga world. And the yoga world is constantly changing. And I think as a full-time yoga teacher who's been doing this for a long time, we have to be open to adapting and changing with the yoga world. And then becomes a challenge of how do we stay true to our yoga as time change. Anyway, that's kind of what I've been thinking a lot lately, and I've been enjoying asking some of the people that I bring on to the show. Little update before we get started on this week's episode. I am excited that my ethical yoga retreat in Nicaragua is happening less than a month away. I think it's maybe even less than 2 weeks away, or somewhere around there, maybe 2 weeks away from now. And this used to be just a vision or dream that I had, that I wanted to lead a yoga retreat that meant more than just going to travel to a beautiful place and practice yoga. I wanted a retreat where we are actually leaving positive impact behind as much as possible and creating least amount of harm as we travel to these beautiful destinations. That is why I created my ethical yoga retreat, where we are partnering with 2 local nonprofit organizations on the ground doing amazing work in the community that we are visiting. Some of the money that participants pay to register for the retreat is going straight to be donated to these local nonprofit organizations. And some of the activities that we're going to do during the retreat is going in to volunteer with these organizations. One of the organizations is called Tucan Learning Center, and it is an after-school program where they teach English to children and youth in the community, because knowing how to speak English can give them more skill sets. It'll give them advantage to be able to get a job in the tourism industry, which is a great opportunity in Nicaragua. Another organization that we'll be volunteering with is called Mujeres que Mueven, and it's an organization that focuses on women's empowerment program in this local rural community in Nicaragua. I am just very excited for this retreat. Everything is coming together and it almost feels surreal because I've been planning this for a really long time, thinking about this for a really long time. And I am at the point where I'm trying to relinquish and surrender my control and grip over wanting things to be exactly the way I want the retreat to be. In the end, I have to kind of surrender and let go and just kind of trust that it will work out and that things will be great, and there's going to be a lot of things that's completely out of my control. And that's also where the beauty lies in organizing a retreat, this natural progression and forming of relationship and community that can happen on a retreat like this. So I'm very excited. I do want to say it hasn't been easy at all. Every step of the way of this retreat has been a great learning experience from the beginning. And there has been some hard lessons I learned during this retreat planning and some heartbreaks as well, which I hope to someday share once I have more experience running retreat. I hope to share a little bit more about mistakes I've made and how not to make those mistakes in the future. But navigating the role of a yoga teacher and a role of a businesswoman, a role of a teacher-student relationship, a role of a friend, a role of a family member, a role of travel agency. It's just so many hats that I had to learn to wear and navigate in this process of organizing and preparing for this retreat. And it's a lot because it's a one-woman show. I do have somebody helping me, but I'm not a big company. I don't have people that I hire who can help me in a lot of these areas. So it's been a great learning experience. At some point it's been really difficult, but also I am extremely excited for this retreat that's coming up in a couple of weeks. I do have one room open if anybody wants to join. Any last minute travel plans. It is happening from July 12th through the 19th. If you're still interested or on the fence about it, feel free to reach out to me and I can chat with you. I'll put the information on the retreat on the show notes. Another announcement I want to make is that for July, I am hosting a guest teachers workshop for my mentorship program for yoga teachers. And the guest teacher's name is AJ. AJ is coming to teach a workshop called Yoga Meets Physical Therapy, Teaching Yoga for Healthy Aging. And what's so unique and interesting and just so excited that I get to bring AJ on. What's so unique about AJ is that AJ is a doctor of physical therapy as well as a 500-hour ERYT yoga teacher. So AJ get to bring in the perspective of being a yoga teacher, yoga student, but also perspective of being a doctor of physical therapy. Because I do believe there's some misinformation out there in the yoga world that doesn't completely agree or on the same page as physical therapy world, and maybe vice versa as well. So I think it'll be great that AJ is coming in to kind of bridge the gap between the PT knowledge, physical therapy knowledge, and yoga teachers knowledge, and we can learn how to work with aging population. If you already teach yoga for aging population like chair yoga, or teach yoga at YMCA or senior center, or maybe you don't teach that population yet, but let's be honest, we are all aging every day. So the information you're going to learn in this class is going to be important and helpful to you no matter what. And what's so amazing about this workshop is that you are going to receive 2 hours of continuing education hours towards Yoga Alliance, and it's a sliding scale pricing for this workshop. So a sliding scale of $10 to $60, you get to decide the amount you want to pay, which I think is a really great deal and so generous of AJ to be offering this workshop in this format. And I also believe that information should be available and accessible to anyone who's willing to learn. So if you're interested in this workshop, it's happening July 26th, Saturday, 2 to 4 p.m. California time, but we are also live streaming it and there will be recording. So if you want to join from another state, another time zone, or maybe you want to watch the recording later, the workshop is available for you to register, sliding scale of $10 to $60. So those are the 2 announcements I wanted to make before we kind of get started on today's episode. Today I have a really exciting guest. I don't know if you ever heard of yoga podcast called J.Brown Yoga Talks. I started listening to podcasts maybe I don't know, close to 10 years ago, maybe like 8 years ago. And I remember listening to his podcast from a long, long time ago, because back then there wasn't a lot of yoga podcasts out there. And Jay has been doing podcasts for about 10 years now, and one of the oldest running yoga podcasts out there. And if you have ever listened to his podcast, he interviews amazing senior yoga teachers from across the different field, across the world, to share about yoga philosophy. But not only does he interview famous yoga teachers from history, he also interviews people like us, somebody who may not be a famous yoga teacher, but who are actually working on the ground and really teaching yoga with passion. He also interviews people who just started teaching yoga, and it's just a variety that he offers, and I really enjoy listening to his podcast. Lately on his podcast, he started talking more and more about where yoga world is going and how it's shifting in the modern world, and whether it's still possible to be a full-time yoga teacher in these days. And when he started talking about this, I actually messaged him and told him that yes, it is possible to be a full-time yoga teacher. It's not easy, but it's still possible. And he actually messaged me back and asked me to be on his podcast. So I'll put the link on the episode that I am on his podcast as a guest, so you can listen to that if you wish. And after that interview, I reached out to Jay and asked if he wants to be on my podcast. And he said yes, which I was so surprised and also excited and honored and slightly nervous about, because I don't know, I get nervous about asking somebody that I really look up to be on my podcast, because I always feel like of course they're going to say no, they're going to be too busy. But he said yes, and I am just so delighted to be able to have really nice, long, quality conversation with him. He's really easy to speak to. If you ever listen to his podcast, you will know he's very real in the way he speaks, how he asks questions, how he answers questions. There's no script, and he just being genuinely who he is. And his podcast was my inspiration when starting my podcast. So I was really happy to have him on. I'm honored to welcome J.Brown, who has been the voice of the yoga world for over 2 decades. Jay is a yoga teacher, writer, and the host of the renowned podcast J.Brown Yoga Talks. Known for his thoughtful approach and commitment to the contemplative aspects of yoga, Jay has challenged conventional ideas in the industry and brought deep, meaningful conversations to light. In this episode, we talk about his journey from grief to yoga, the early days of studio ownership, and how his teaching and podcasting have evolved over the years. This is a conversation full of honesty, depth, and perspective for anyone navigating the modern yoga world. I hope you enjoy the conversation I had with Jay, and I will speak to you on the other side. Welcome, Jay, to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. And I'm actually, I was a little bit scared and hesitant to ask you to come on to be interviewed on my show. I don't know, because I've been listening to your podcast for a long time, and I wasn't sure if you would say yes. So I was really thrilled and excited when you said, yeah, sure. So thank you so much for being here. I had a really good time being interviewed on your show, J.Brown Yoga Talk Show.
Mm-hmm.
And let's start with, where are you joining this call from, and where are you originally from?
Well, first, let me say I'm happy that you reached out and asked me to come, because I know what it is to do a podcast, as you know. And that's one of the cool things that's been my experience in podcasting in the early days, especially early days of podcasting, where I would send an email to a person who I would never think would do it, and then they'd say yes. And it's pretty cool. I mean, now people know podcasts a lot more, maybe even a little harder now than it was back then. But I'm always happy to come on people's show, and people rarely ask me. So I'm very happy that you did, and I'm glad to be here.
Okay.
To your question, I am currently coming to you from Easton, Pennsylvania, which is just on the other side of the Delaware River from New Jersey. It's about an hour and 45 minutes from Manhattan.
Okay.
And I moved here in 2017. I came from Brooklyn. I was in Brooklyn and New York City for 20 years or so, 25 years before I came here. And prior to that, I lived in Los Angeles, which is where I grew up. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, Canoga Park, Woodland Hills area. I know you and some of your listeners might be from that area and know of which I speak. I spent a fair amount of my time riding over Topanga Canyon Boulevard to the beach on my bike. We did all kinds of crazy, not safe things back in the 80s when I was growing up there. And then I moved to New York to go to NYU in 1990.
And where were you first introduced to yoga? Was it in California or was it after you moved to New York?
No, I was not introduced to anything like yoga in California. I went to acting school at NYU, and as part of the freshman acting program, the movement component, one of the classes was a yoga class. It was taught by a woman named Maud Carlson, and some people might know her from the New York days, and she was a very hardcore, like Iyengar style teacher. We used to call her Maud, Swedish mistress of pain, because I had a really hard class. But I remember at that time, I was really pretty messed up. You know, my mom had died when I was 16, and that really came home to roost when I got to school and started doing acting training where you had to like get in touch with your emotions and stuff. And it really actually took me into like a pretty dark kind of place in my life. And that yoga class, I remember there was a moment where I was done with the class and I noticed that I felt a little bit better. And there was just like never times where I would feel better. And that class, it was hard and I didn't even like it that much, but I noticed that despite my will, it made me feel better. And then years later, really, when I was near graduating and things were still getting kind of worse, kind of in desperation, I had a friend of mine who I was telling about how miserable I was. And this friend asked me, well, is there anything that you know that you do that like brings you joy? Like, what is it? Is there anything that you know that makes you feel good? And I could only identify two things. One was playing my electric bass guitar and the other was yoga classes. And she said, you should do those two things every day. And I just thought, that's a really good idea. And I just started doing it 2 days. I started going to yoga classes every day at Jivamukti Yoga Center on 2nd Avenue. And that was really where I think I had that initial experience when I was in college. But I think that moment when my friend said that to me and I just started going to classes on my own at Jiva, that's when I feel like my practice really sort of started.
And I hear about Jivamukti class from people who lived in New York a lot. I have never taken a Jivamukti class. So what kind of yoga is it?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I know a little bit. What I would say is at that time, when I was going there in early 90s, there hadn't become a Jivamukti method yet. They hadn't created a thing and then called it Jivamukti Yoga yet. It was just a center. And it was run by David Life and Sharon Gannon. And they had a totally eclectic group of teachers teaching there. Leslie Kaminoff taught there. One of my teachers, Allison West, taught there. Ananda was another teacher of mine. Like all these really different kinds of people. They had all studied maybe Shivananda or Iyengar, or then Patabi Joyce was brought and people got into that. And it was the first time, I think, well, not maybe the first time, it was happening in Los Angeles too with Mati and Chuck at Yoga Zone. They were doing the same thing. Yoga Works, not Yoga Zone, Yoga Works. They were hybriding things, right? They were
Yeah.
learning these different systems, and sometimes they were sticking to them and doing like Mysore rooms in the morning, but then there was just the more general classes, which they were calling different things. They weren't even really calling it vinyasa yoga so much, but that's what it sort of become. But it was when they were first really hybriding. And I would say also that Sharon and David had a performance art background. So it was really where I think classes started having playlists, like they put music in and they were kind of creating an experience, and it had an arc. Like to this day, you start on the floor seated and you begin, and then you get up and you do your sun salutations or whatever. And then you go to the wall, right? And then you come back down and you do your back bends, and then like that kind of like framework of a class. Kind of materialized there. Now, what I would say is there was a very specific moment where I've had people talk about this on my show, where Sharon and David, they did their first teacher training, and it was for free. It was free. It was free teacher training. My teacher, Kachi, did it. And then the next one they did after that was you paid for it. I knew a woman named Lilia Mead who was in that training.
Yeah.
And at that moment, they decided that if you were teaching at the center, you had to attend kirtan. They like made a rule. Like it was like mandatory attendance.
Okay.
And a bunch of teachers were like, I'm out. Leslie Kamenoff and Allison West, they left. And I followed Allison. That's when I left Jivamukti, and I went and I followed this one teacher who I was really into at the time. Because it was about the teacher. It was all about the teacher.
Yeah.
Which teacher you wanted to learn from. And that's when Jivamukti really sort of started to become Jivamukti method. Now, to finish your question, what is a Jivamukti class like? It did end up becoming a little bit more standardized. I remember people who taught at Jivamukti after it had moved to Union Square, and there was rules, like you had to have a certain amount, certain poses had to be in every class that was like established. And you had to do a Dharma talk. You had to do a Dharma talk at the beginning, which I always thought was sort of not a great idea. Like you have newer teachers trying to give Dharma talks to people twice their age. Not always the greatest idea, but they had a lot of rules, and they had people checking, people who would take classes like secretly, and then if you weren't doing everything, you'd get reported. So there was eventually like much more standardization. I do think it's basically a vinyasa flow class. And yeah, with a good playlist. And usually, like I said, like a Dharma talk or even some chanting at the beginning. They always had chanting at that time, which I know doesn't happen in all vinyasa yoga classes now. But
so was this time when Jivamukti was getting popular and they were kind of creating their own method or way of teaching? Is this just around the same time that Mati and Chuck was kind of building their yoga works style in LA?
Yeah, I think that happened totally in parallel. Like East Coast, West Coast, they were doing the same thing.
Interesting. And I just want to quickly touch on the Dharma talk that happened in the beginning and like sprinkled in the middle and in the end. And I still, Yoga Works never taught me that, but that's kind of what I see a lot these days. And what's also been taught in teacher training is teachers being taught to do the Dharma talk in the beginning, sprinkle in the middle, and then do a little bit at the end kind of thing. I think maybe it was Annie Carpenter, but I think she must have mentioned that's kind of where it came from, was Jivamukti, that kind of trying to bring in Dharma talk that way.
I think that's right. I mean, I don't know if it was just Jivamukti, but that was like a feature. And for me, like back in the day, when I first went to Jivamukti, the classes were an hour and 45 minutes long.
Oh, yeah.
And they had a lot of yoga education in them. Like the teachers were teaching like a lot of what would now be gotten in yoga teacher training programs was just in the classes. There wasn't teacher training programs yet. So the classes were longer and there was all this yoga education in the classes more. So there was a lot more, just instruction. In terms of Dharma talks, I think that Sharon and David were really talented at that. It felt very, like I particularly went to David's class quite a bit. I liked his class a little bit more than Sharon's, but I found his talk very inspiring, It opened my mind up to new ideas I had never heard before, Eastern spirituality in general. He pointed to text and he offered a lot of learning, a lot of yoga education.
Mhm.
So I think as time went on, though, and things got scaled up and more
Mhm.
standardized, and it just became not about this like that individual teacher and me having a relating to what that teacher was saying in the
Mhm.
room, and it became more like, oh, everybody does a Dharma talk at the beginning, you know.
Yeah.
I will say I have also noticed that there's a while where that Dharma talking kind of got taken out, especially because classes did get a lot shorter. But I
Mhm.
think nowadays, more recently, there's
Mhm.
been a little bit of like, if you want to distinguish yourself a little bit, you're
Yeah.
bringing more than just leading the sequence.
Yeah.
You're sprinkling in some other stuff, you
Yeah.
know?
It's interesting because Annie Annie Carpenter's one of my main teacher, and she doesn't bring any Dharma talk during asana class. And she's, similar to what you said of like sometimes it doesn't feel right if the teacher's 20 something and then giving a Dharma talk to students who might be in their 40s or 50s or who's been practicing way longer. But she also believed that, she'll teach philosophy when it's like a workshop or training or something more specific to that, but she doesn't really try to bring it into asana class. And she feels like that kind of takes people out of being in the present moment. So, yeah, it's interesting that, different perspective. And I always appreciated when she said that because I felt like it took a pressure off of me that I didn't have to give Dharma talk because, when you're a new teacher, you're just like, you're just trying to figure out how to get through a 60-minute class.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way as Annie, generally speaking. Like, I feel the way I've always put it is it is like,
Mm.
if you have a practice in the morning and you do a practice and then you're sitting at your altar and there's a book of poetry there and you pick up this poem and you read this poem and it like really hits you and you have well up with emotion. You're like, this really meant something to me. And then you bring that with you into class and then you share it with your class.
Mm.
There's a very good chance that someone else in that class is going to get something from that.
Mm.
But if you were just like, woke up in the morning late and you're like, oh crap, I got to get to my class. Oh crap, I need something for my Dharma talk. And you grab the poetry book and like on the subway on the way there, you're like, oh, I'll use this one. And then you show up and you just read it in class,
Mm.
then it doesn't have any impact. So my feeling is like, if you're inspired, I think
Yeah.
I sometimes, I don't really think of it as Dharma talks anymore because I don't give Dharma talks, but I do what I would think are kind of like seed thoughts where you like have certain ideas that are like feeling inspirational to you or like related to the practice that you're offering on that day. And you can
Yeah.
give someone things to think about as well as what they're experiencing in their practice. I think that can be very useful. But I think now that I have other areas for that, I have like weekly teachers, Sangha, and like teacher training that I do where I have lots of opportunities to work with people who want to learn and do yoga education in other ways, that asana practices are a little more dedicated to just that. And I'm not trying to interject as much as we might have in the past. I think that's changed them.
Yeah. And I know since after the Jivamukti decided to make kirtan a requirement, you said you left because you're kind of following your teacher. And at what point did you decide or realize or become a teacher or like that this idea of, oh, I want to become a teacher come into your, I guess, mind space, or did it just kind of happen? I know some people just get like asked to sub by their teacher, back.
Well, a little more like that. What happened was it was right there at that time. There was a brief period of time where I was doing both. I was going to Allison West's class. She was renting space somewhere else. She had left. And the reason why she and Leslie left is they felt like it was becoming kind of culty around them and they weren't on board for that.
Yeah.
So I always had a little bit of that skeptical view because those were teachers I identified with. But I was still going to Kachi's class and she still taught there. So there was this moment of time where I was kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out of Jivamukti. And at that time, I had kind of hit what I would call like my peak of physical ability with asana. Like I was doing like a lot of really flashy asana practice, like press handstands and, full splits and all kinds of like big poses. And, so I was often being asked to do demonstrations in class and whatnot.
Yeah.
I had not taught any yoga classes at all before, but I was there every day and I was practicing and being asked to do demonstrations. And then one day, a woman who I had never met before out in the hallway said to me, "Hey, I have this yoga class at the YMCA that I can't teach anymore. Do you want it?" And I just said, yeah. So I took a class at the YMCA and I had no training, but I had certainly had a lot of practice. And I just started mimicking and emulating what the teachers I was going to were doing in that class. And I was studying very closely with Allison West. And soon thereafter, she did offer her first teacher training, her first 200-hour teacher training, which was offered very shortly after they first announced that there was such a thing as a 200-hour training. She was one of the very first people to jump on board with it. But I had been studying with her, like, and going to her class at least a couple times a week for like almost 2 years at that point. So by the time she did that training, I had really absorbed a lot of what she was teaching. And so very soon even during that training, she had me leading some things with other students. And then as soon as I was done with the month-long training, I was teaching classes under her auspices as well, similar to you, like with Annie. I was teaching under her auspices at her place. And then there was quite a boom of private at that time. So I had 6 or 7 private clients, and then I was teaching for her, and I was teaching that other class. So yeah, that's how it kind of rolled. And then pretty soon thereafter, I just really embraced it. There was one moment in like 1998 where I became disillusioned. I had like kind of a lot of pain in my body, and I had gotten a lot better, but I was still really very disillusioned about life and unreconciled over my mom's death. And really, like, I could do big handstands and everybody was saying I was advanced, but I still felt pretty crappy. And so I almost like quit yoga almost for a second. I was like, I don't think this is working. This is bull. And I had this dear friend who had known me before I got into yoga and then seen me after getting into yoga. And he said, I don't think you should quit yet. I think you're better at this than the other things I've seen you do. He knew me when I was an actor and a musician and stuff. And he's like, you're better. He thought I was good at this. And it kind of meant a lot from a friend to say that. And he said, I tell you what, why don't we take a trip to India? Because that was kind of the thing. It was sort of almost like maybe I'll find a guru or something like that. So in 1998, I did take this trip to India for 3 months. We saved up money and we just went. We didn't go to an ashram. We just like went with a backpack and like a let's go travel guide and like decided we didn't want to go where the tourists were. So anywhere there weren't tourists. And I did look for teachers wherever I went, and I found kind of a lot of like crooks, honestly, but I did find one really special teacher in Rishikesh who kind of turned it around for me. And I wouldn't say he was a guru, but he pointed me to some new ideas about yoga that I hadn't heard of, essentially like more tantric ideas. And it really kind of opened it up, and that kind of solidified in my mind. I was like, okay, I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I got to give this another shot. And I changed the yoga that I was doing at that time. And that's when I discovered Desikachar, who has sort of since become like my main inspiration, because those teachings from Desikachar was what helped me sort things out for myself.
And when you were studying with Leslie Kaminoff in New York, was he student of Desikachar by that time, or what did that come later?
Yeah, I didn't study a lot with Leslie early on. I had taken his class and I certainly knew of him. But yes, he was a student of Desikachar. And so we kind of had a circle that we ran in together. And then I studied with someone named Mark Whitwell, was sort of my main teacher who studied with Desikachar. At some point, Leslie opened up a place called the Breathing Project that was like kind of like a collective, like a yoga teacher collective idea, or one of the first of its kind, maybe. And it was sort of vaguely dedicated to people who were into that kind of teaching. So he invited me to teach a class there. So I sort of knew Leslie there. Years later, though, when I had a center, at one point in time when my kids were of a certain age, I had a little bit of time. And I said to my wife, I was like, I really want to be a student. I need to be a student again because it'd been a lot of years. And so I took Leslie Kamenoff's Principles Anatomy course. And right now, if somebody goes online and takes it online, you'll see me. I'm in there. I happened to be the one that they were filming. So I asked a million questions in the training. So I did get a chance ultimately to study with Leslie. And I do think that Jessica chart teachings really do kind of bring us together. He has an anatomical lens that he looks at it through, which is different from me. I'm not really an anatomy guy by nature. But studying with Leslie was really affirming and helpful to me to kind of see it. It gave me new language for what I was doing as a teacher, which was just super helpful.
Yeah. I have a few follow-up questions.
Please.
I know you said you were doing quote-unquote advanced poses, but then you were in pain, or there was a moment that you thought about maybe quitting yoga. Did bigger poses come naturally to you as you started kind of practicing yoga and early on? And did the pain and aches or injury, did those come a few years later? And then what was it besides maybe the pain, physical pain, that made you feel like maybe you wanted to quit, or maybe this wasn't the path for me?
No, those are good questions. I think that I did have some natural ability. Think now I might easily be diagnosed as having a hypermobility syndrome disorder. I've hypermobility, not just in terms of just flexible of my body, but other connective tissue issues. I don't know if you know about hypermobility syndrome disorders, but I'm a candidate for that. So I do think I had a lot of natural ability, but also I just loved it. I mean, I really felt like asanas were so fun. I thought of them as three-dimensional sacred geometry with my body. And I enjoyed the challenge of being able to do something with my body that I didn't think I could do. And I kind of reveled in the physicality. And honestly, at that time, that's how a lot of times you would earn credibility. Even to this day, if you can bust out stuff that other people can't do, then it's sort of oh, look at him or whatever. But at some point, I do think that there was a lot that I was doing to my body that was really not what I needed. I've come away from, I don't think poses are inherently injurious. And I know a lot of people who do a lot of poses that I don't do, and they're perfectly great. So I'm not wanting to judge poses or other people's practice, but I found that I was not practicing in a way that was about me nurturing and caring for myself. I was trying to accomplish things. I was trying to push myself. And I think that there are times where that's good and necessary in life. If you're going to run a marathon, you really do need to no pain, no gain it to make that happen. But at a certain point, my yoga practice, that was the shift I was talking about. It needed to become about something else. I actually know specifically when it shifted because I mentioned that Swami. And that Swami is very significant because the first time I practiced with him, well, first I should say there was no schedule. There was no drop-in classes, which I was unaccustomed to. Usually you look at the schedule and then you know what time to go to class. But in this instance, you would have to have an interview with the teacher. And I got to see someone else have their interview first. There was somebody, a Westerner, in front of me. And she went up to the teacher and the teacher said, "What do you want to learn?" And she said, "Well, I have really bad posture and I heard yoga's good for that." And he said, "Yes, yoga's very good for that. You come this many days a week and you pay me this much." And I was sitting there watching that thinking, I don't want to know anything about poses anymore. I was like, my head was full up with alignment and sequences and mantras. I could chant Sanskrit mantras and I still felt miserable. I don't want to have anything to do with, I needed help in another way, you know? And I got up to him and he said, what do you want to learn? And I said, anything I don't already know. And he said, good, you come every day. And initially what happened was he said, do you know Dhanurasana bow pose? And I said, yes. And he said, show me. And I did the biggest, fanciest version of Dhanurasana with my feet on my head that I could do.
Yeah.
And he said, yes, children also do very well. So he was totally unimpressed by that. And so what in New York, everybody was applauding and calling advanced. He was comparing to like a child. And then instead, what we did was incredibly simple practices. Like I do really simple practice now, but the practices I did with that Swami were even simpler. Like just make circles with your wrist. This way and then this way. And at the time, I was like a power vinyasa guy. To me, this was like not even a warm-up, you know, it was just like kind of a waste of time. And then we would stop and he would say, okay, sit for a moment. And we would sit for like less than a minute. He'd say, okay, open your eyes. Tell me, how do you feel? And for the first times he asked me that, I would think what was happening is I was a young teacher and I was trying to impress him. I wanted to show him that I knew a lot about yoga. So I would say, well, I noticed this impingement in my wrist and you know, like when like a young teacher's kind of talking out their butt. And it was just totally stupid because he didn't even speak very good English. So I don't even think he understood half of what I was saying. And then he would kind of get annoyed. And he would say, let's try something else. And we would do it again. And it went on for a period of time, like a day or two, where he would have me do a simple thing. We would sit. He would say, how do you feel? I would talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And then he would get really annoyed. And then one morning I woke up and I was in a really bad mood. Like a dark cloud was over me. I was thinking about what I'm going to do when I go back home. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I'm not learning anything from this Swami and I'm wasting all this time in India. There's no gurus here. I was like kind of really in this like swirl of bad thoughts. And I got to the lesson and the same thing happened again. And we did some simple dumb thing. And then he asked me how I felt and I kind of snapped. And I said, I don't know how I feel. And he smiled really big and he said, good. And it was like a thing where I was like, oh, it like hit me. Like he kept asking me this question, how do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel? And I kept talking and talking and talking and never once answering the question. Because I had no idea how I felt. And nobody else was asking me that. Like I studied with very renowned teachers and nobody was like, how do you feel? How does doing this practice make you feel? And that became my new rubric. How do I feel? How does what I'm practicing make me feel? And if I can't find a good reason for it, or it's not making me feel in the way that I wish to feel, I'm not going to do it anymore. And I felt emboldened when I got back to New York because I had met this Swami guy who like spent most of the year up in a cave. And he kind of told me that it was okay for me to like have it be based on how I feel, that I could kind of determine that.
Wow.
So that was a big deal. And I got back to New York and I really couldn't keep taking the same yoga classes anymore. I just started doing self-practice by myself at home. And then I learned about Desikachar and that's what Desikachar taught, like one-to-one teaching, people learning a personal practice that they do by themselves. And then I ultimately decided that I wanted to bring that. If I was going to be a yoga teacher, then I needed to teach that. And that was another moment where I was still teaching like power flows, but I was doing a totally different thing by myself at home. And I was really not in a good place then either because it didn't feel good. And I told my teacher at the time that I was like, I'm practicing this way at home, but I'm teaching all these other styles because that's what people want. And I was paying my rent as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, hey, man, if you don't teach what you do at home in your class, you're a fraud. And I was like, and, I don't know if I totally agree with that statement, but at the time it was very significant to me. And I made a choice. I'm like, you know what? He's right. And I changed my class, and a bunch of people left because they didn't like it anymore. But then a whole bunch of different kind of people came.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, what I would say is I did a really unconventional thing, which is I started basically teaching the same program every time. I stopped coming up with new sequences for all my classes.
Yeah.
Kind of like the way Ashtanga is, but it's a simple program, but it was repeating. So I could teach these principles rather than have people trying to follow along with the choreography. And some people weren't into it. And I remember getting called into one of the yoga center owner's office. You were talking about that when you were on my show. I remember getting called into the yoga center owner's office. And the yoga center owner said, so Jay, I heard something from some students, some feedback that you're doing the same thing every time now? And she was super confused. And, I said yes. And I explained it to her. I was like, I'm really inspired by Desikachar, and this is what I'm doing. And you know what? She was super supportive. And she was like, okay. And she started coming to my class. And I don't think that happens so much these days anymore, where the yoga center owner was intrigued because she hadn't really knew too much about Desikachar teachings. And so she was curious. And so she gave me leeway to really go against the grain and make a big change as a teacher. And that was, you hear sometimes about these heydays where people had these yoga homes where they were kind of supported as teachers and allowed to grow. And that was, for me, that place, that woman, I mentioned her earlier, Lily Amit, she had a center named Go Yoga. She had been trained at Jivamukti, and then she opened a place in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And I taught there for a lot of years, and she just really supported me and let me kind of find what my teaching needed to be.
That's very challenging to completely change your teaching style. Especially if a bunch of students left, they're expecting certain kind of style of class from you, or they also try as a teacher trying to offer or trying to teach what's popular, what's gonna sell out your room or sell out your class, and then going against the grain of that. And this doesn't feel authentic to me, and I want to teach what feels more authentic to me, and that takes courage. So I applaud you for doing that, and also telling your owners once she asked and how supportive she was. That sounds really amazing. And thinking about it in a modern day, now, I think a lot of teachers listening to this will understand. A lot of teachers I speak to and get to interview on the show, there's sometimes a little conflict of what they want to teach versus what they have to teach, maybe because studio or gym has a regulation on how to teach certain certain classes, or because there's an internal pressure that they feel of this is what's popular, this is what students want, so going against that, I think is such a challenge. So I think that's so great that you made that shift. Was it an overnight switch you did, or did you slowly gradually change your
It was a kind of slightly abrupt. There was, it was a little bit gradual. I had dropped a lot of things out and sort of slowing it down some. But there was one day in particular where it just got really clear, where I was like, oh, you know what? I'm not doing this anymore. I had come up with some sequence, and I don't know. At some point, I did just sort of draw a line, and I made a pretty big switch. And, it's interesting to hear you say what you just said, because I do think that as time has gone on, I don't really think things are the same as they were back then. And when you say that, I have a lot of people who come to my Sangha who are people who teach styles that are simpler or slower or more gentler, because that's what I'm into. And so we kind of want to get together because we're in a minority, and our classes aren't as well attended as the hot-paced, fast class. You came on my show and we talked about how these days there's less yoga specific centers and it's more rolled into a boutique fitness thing.
Yeah.
And there's a niche for this still. It's the yin or the slow flow or the therapeutic flows. There's a place for it in that new world. But it's almost you don't, what I think's lacking or what we don't have now that we did then is this kind of like laboratory feels around yoga centers more. They were independently owned by one person who you could have a relationship to and you could develop as a teacher. And nowadays you're supposed to show up and audition and kind of be more fully formed or something. And I think that's why it's been so hard, and teachers are looking for mentors more because just the way things are, there's not as much of an organic process for teachers to develop what they do.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Hmm.
And definitely, maybe I think we talked about it a little bit when I came on your show, but I think these days, newer teachers coming up, like you said, they're looking for more mentors. Like they didn't, like in your time when you were coming up, you had teachers that you went to and practice with all the time. And now there isn't that. They just go take, drop-in classes from Core Power or drop-in class from this gym. So they don't really have one or two or a few specific teachers that they follow and learn from. So there's almost loss of lineage. They don't know where the lineage come from. Like for me, it's nice to know, like, I have Amy as a teacher, and her teacher was Sharath and Patabi Joyce, but also her teachers was Chase and then Desika Jar and Krishnamacharya. Like, it's nice to know there's a lineage that I can trace back. And I think that's missing a lot. And I think maybe that leads to many teachers looking for teachers and mentors these days.
I think you're right. I also think that there has been more of like a standardization. So, like you say, places kind of are dictating what the classes are going to be a little bit more. So to students, they're the same in a lot of ways. It's just there's subtle differences because I think yoga teachers know that there's a certain subtle energetic thing that happens where you can have two teachers who are teaching the same sequence, but it's not going to be the same class.
Yeah.
Even when they use the same script sometimes. They can say the same words and do the same poses, and it's not the same class because there's some kind of other thing that a teacher's bringing, their person that's coming to the room, right? So I do think that there's that, but because of that, teachers, I don't know, again, it used to be there was much more of like your class, like your teachers were able to develop a little bit more of like what they say, your voice or your unique kind of take on things. And it was encouraged, and you saw your teachers doing that. You were inspired by them.
Yeah.
But nowadays it's a little bit different. I don't know. I haven't been out there so much. I don't know in the way you do, but
I think there are, outliers, and there are great teachers and great studios, but it's a little bit becoming challenging to find because there's this like big corporate studios, that's big companies, and they are trying to produce teachers and classes that is easily replicable. I'm going to use the example Core Power again, but they're all over the country, so they want to teach a training and they want to produce teachers who can teach exactly the same way. No matter what part of the country you go take Core Power's class, it's going to be the same. It's almost like McDonald's. Like if you go to go get McDonald's at other states, other cities, you can expect the same thing. And that's kind of what they're trying to create.
I know that's considered like quality control in a sense. But the problem is in yoga, if we were to agree that yoga is a mystical tradition that involves some kind of transference or interpersonal exchange between teachers and students, then what you just described as being a great thing for a business is in certain ways contradictory to what I would call the pedagogy of yoga, to the way that yoga is shared. And that's one of the very fundamental dilemmas we've come up against in the yoga world, especially as it became bigger business. But I do think the corporate change, they don't have a hold on it on the market as they used to, you know what I mean? They're still out there, they're still managing, but at one point they really took over. I remember when Yoga Works, after Mati sold it and they had all the corporate backing and everything, they came to Manhattan and they literally bought 4 independent centers and they opened Yoga Works Uptown, Yoga Works Downtown, Yoga Works East, Yoga Works West. They just came in and swooped in and kind of took over. And they did good stuff or whatever. Like they had a wide range of different classes. And people thought of it as being quality because, like you said, they had created all of these sort of standards they were following. But you did lose sort of the kind of crazy, magical East Village artists doing yoga thing.
Okay, I want to ask, that brings you to I know you opened your own studio in New York. So how did that come about from being a teacher and teaching private classes? And it sounds like you were kind of changed the way you were teaching, the type of classes you were teaching. And how did that transition into becoming a studio owner?
That was a pretty already established progression in a way. Like if you were looking to advance your career at that time, career progression, after a while, you're teaching for more than 10 years. You're like a senior teacher at 2 or 3 centers. Your classes are consistently well attended. At this point, I had gained some reputation in that area, and people knew about me, and my classes were all packed. It was a booming time for yoga.
So people were really enjoying your slower.
I really honed it, and I had found a way to kind of present it in a way that fit into the scene. It looked enough like a vinyasa class for people to not. That was what my idea was. I want to take these principles of Desikachar, one-to-one practice, and I want to put them into what we think of as a vinyasa yoga class. And I kind of came up with my gentle is the new advanced thing that I was doing. And it definitely became a signature thing, and people were coming to the centers for that now. People were referring people to me as a teacher. As you've described on your show, as time goes on, that started happening for me. And it was a very natural thing. At a certain point, you would just start to run numbers in your head about what your pay was and how many people were coming to your class. And it just started to not feel like the cut was fair. And I just seen that happen. Lilia, the woman I mentioned, she taught at Jivamukti and then she left and opened her own place. I taught at her place for a long while. And at a certain point, I wanted, I think, to have a place that was just dedicated to this approach, because I did sort of come up against some issues at the centers where what I was teaching in some ways did kind of call into question what other classes did. I wasn't always as mature about it as well. I think I sometimes said things in a way that did create an adversarial relationship where I don't know that I needed to. But, I was really advocating for something that was contrary to what a lot of other teachers were telling people to do. And at some point, I would almost feel like people felt like mine was the beginner, and then they would graduate from mine and do these other kinds of practices. And that kind of felt like, gosh, I'm doing all this stuff to establish these foundations of practice with people. And then they're being allured by the flash and all that other stuff that had caused me pain that I talked about earlier that I had let go of. So I really wanted a place where I didn't feel up against that all the time, where there wasn't going to be this expectation and it was just going to be dedicated to this type of practice. And really the only reason it happened is because of a very fluky thing where I was online in the early internet days. And I found some woman, I believe she was in San Francisco, who had found this thing at the SBA where you could get these loans. They would call Community Express loans. And if you had a really good credit score, but no assets, you don't have any money, but you have good credit, she could get you a loan. And she got me this loan for $15,000.
Oh, wow.
And that was it. And then I found this space, and then that lasted 10 years before. I'd say the first 7 years we did great. We totally grew with the neighborhood, and more money came in than went out, and everything was beautiful. And I didn't even have a spreadsheet for the first 5. I didn't even keep track for the first 5 years. It was just working, And then I did start to keep more track. And then at about 7 years, we hit a point where it peaked, and all of the corporate chains had come in. Modo Yoga had moved down the street.
Yeah.
And I was trying to have to compete with all of these
Yeah.
bigger centers, and I really couldn't at some point.
Uh-huh.
And so I struggled through as best as I could, and then I got out at the end of 10 years. I got lucky, like someone bought me out of my lease, another person who wanted to try to have a yoga center there,
Okay.
which enabled me to leave. And they didn't even last a year after they took over the lease. But yeah, I had a good run of it. I really developed in a very deep way what I was doing as a teacher. And I developed a community, like some of the people who still attend my stuff online now, I met at that time.
Mm. And when you said that, different studios, bigger studios were opening up around, is that also around the time the Yoga Works started opening and becoming bigger in New York?
Yeah, Yoga Works, I would say a little bit before the time I was just describing, had come in and
Yeah.
bought all those centers, and they were there. But then I remember it was Moto Yoga was the one that moved into Williamsburg, and they were doing they were doing live music, and it was like hip, cool vibes,
Yeah.
And I was like this like old school Deskachar dude. And I still had like people who were into what I was doing, but at a certain point also I just think the neighborhood in general, when I started opening, it was all artists who were there and would come. You'd have 20 people in class on Wednesday at 2 p.m. because there was like nobody was at a 9-to-5 job, And at a certain point, those people couldn't afford to live in that neighborhood anymore. They had all moved away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just couldn't. And even the landlord, he lived upstairs and really liked me and he really wanted me to stay, but just like the price per square foot just got so crazy. You'd get like built into your lease every year, there'd be like a 3% increase. But at the lease renewal every 5 years, it'd be like a 30-40% jump.
Wow.
And I passed the first one on, like we just raised the price of all the classes like $1 or something, to try to like cover that. But when it came time, the second one was like, it just wasn't doable. It just wasn't, you couldn't make it work anymore.
But that's around the time that I know I have heard you speak on the podcast about you had a business partner or somebody who kind of encouraged you to start online offerings or, you have these email lists that you can do your own thing even if you move away. And I know you talked a little bit about like 1,000 fans. Like if you have 1,000 people in your community that's like really want to support you, you can actually, like successfully run business like that. So I want to know, like, how did you transition from that having in-person studios to what you moved and now you have now in-person and online offerings, but how was that transition like? And I guess I'm curious about this philosophy of 1,000 fans.
Yeah. I met a guy in my classes at Go Yoga before I opened my center. There was a guy named Joshua Citron who liked my class. He went to my class. Apparently, I always forgot his name and called him by the wrong name. But like he came to my class and we had made some connection and I think he got something from my class. And as I said, it was different than other classes and he really appreciated it. And then years later, I was teaching a program at Kripalu. I had somebody I knew there who was championing me and I taught there for a few years and he saw that I was in the catalog at Kripalu and he's like, oh my God, that's Jay from Brooklyn. And he came and we had like a really lovely reunion and connection. And he had a background in music and video production. He was actually a composer. He was part of a team of people who created the theme music for Dora the Explorer. If you know Dora the Explorer. And so he kind of watched the way this thing that started out as like a soul project for kids got bought by Nickelodeon and became this massive, mega money-making corporate thing. And he kind of got out early on. He could have actually made way more money, but he was pretty disgusted by what happened. And so he got out and then he he got money from that and he used that to like produce like independent artists and stuff. And then he came to my workshop and he said to me, I want to shoot you doing the practice so that I can practice to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh yeah, sure. I want to document it because I didn't even know what I looked like while I was doing it. I've been teaching it for a decade, but nobody was shooting video of themselves doing their practice.
Yeah.
So I was like, absolutely. So he came to the studio, we set up cameras and lighting, and he shot me doing it. And afterwards he said, you know what, this could really be a yoga, like we could make a yoga DVD out of this. Everybody had a DVD, like Rodney Yee yoga DVDs or whatever. And I said, okay. So I did like an audio overdub that went to the video we made, and that became J.Brown Yoga DVD. And that's where our relationship started. And at some point after that had gotten going and we actually were selling a fair amount of those, he said to me, you know, you need to start live streaming your classes. And I said, what? No. And he said, listen, at some point, you're not going to have that center. And if you start live streaming them now, people who you know now will be able to practice with you wherever you are in the future. But if you don't, you're going to lose contact with those people.
What year was this when he?
Oh, that was maybe 2015, 2016. Okay. And so I did start, initially it was one way via YouTube live streaming. So like I couldn't see any of them.
Yeah.
We did have a way where they kind of signed in so I knew if people were there.
Yeah.
But I couldn't see them. They could just see me.
Yeah.
And then eventually later on, we switched over to Zoom. That was before the pandemic. And I was doing a crazy thing where I was projecting my screen onto a back wall, like really big.
Yeah.
So I could see everybody really big. Nowadays, I think that's kind of weird. I wouldn't do that. But like back then I was, and it was kind of a thing, but it did get it set up, the infrastructure of that, as well as a weekly teacher's call. We kind of had come to that even before the pandemic happened, and that was kind of working in a good way. And then when the pandemic happened, I was already set up. So I didn't have to scramble at all. Everything was totally in place. So I kind of, one of the people who got to really experience a bit of a boom time initially because of that.
So you were already teaching like live stream yoga plus in person at the same time before the pandemic.
Yeah.
That's
I was.
amazing.
Well, it took some getting used to because people in the room were really weird about it. And it's like, oh, do I have to get consent forms?
Yeah.
Whatever. But eventually, even before, like everybody loosened up during the pandemic about it. But I kind of observed that at a certain point, like people who were practicing at home were often barely looking at the screen. They're listening to the audio and following along.
Yeah.
But definitely not looking at anybody who's in the class.
Yeah.
You know, so people were always worried their butts in the air. But I think one of the things about projecting it on the screen is people in person could see the people who were there online too. And they could see, oh, they're not even looking, their butts in the air too. So people kind of got over it.
Yeah.
I do think it's a different skill teaching online, but I certainly embraced it. And at this point, I've proved it to myself that you can have real yoga with people because I've had people practice with me online for like years and then go meet them in person. And it's totally real, you know, even the friendship that gets formed.
Yeah.
So I did embrace it ultimately. I do think at some point it got overboard for me where, you know, before the pandemic, it was probably 60% in person, 40% online. And then it sort of shifted. And then during the pandemic, it went completely 100% online. And then it started coming back a little bit. It was like 90 online, 10 in person. And I remember just sitting, it's like I pulled back from myself sitting in a room by myself with a laptop doing a yoga class. And I like kind of freaked out. I was like, I'm in a Black Mirror episode. This is really weird. I mean, I like it. I get to have all this yoga with people still, but I need to be in a room with people. That's where it all started.
Yeah, definitely. That's that's how Annie teaches class out of Oakland studio, and same studio that Richard Rosen teaches at.
Oh, cool. I had Richard on the show as well. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. But they have kind of like, got their system down where she teaching in person in a studio room full of students, but then they have a camera and computer and like a big TV setup. So people are joining via Zoom to take Annie's class, but live because she has
Mhm.
students from, Europe and and even people from LA. And she'll sometimes like choose me or whoever's on Zoom as a spotlight. So like then for people who joining online, they'll just see like me practicing as if somebody need a visual,
Yeah.
not the people in the actual studio room.
Yeah, yeah.
But then it takes a skill, but she's very good at acknowledging everybody and verbally cueing like each individual when she'll come to the
Well, that's interesting though about spotlighting you. I suppose if you're going to take the class and you're going to do the whole class, I know for me at one point, particularly when, even after it became two-way, I mentioned I have like hypermobility syndrome disorder stuff. So I sometimes will get pain flares where I'll have like really bad pain, which, for a yoga teacher is kind of a very difficult thing to deal with. Like if you're in a lot of pain, like whether or not you can teach sometimes is in question, and some teachers can. So anyways, what happened one time is I was having to do everything because it was actually before it was two-way. So it was just me in screen doing the class for people to practice to. And I had this like major pain flare. And I said to my producer, Josh, at the time, I said, I can't do this. I can't get on camera and do this perform all these asana when I'm in this pain. Like I would never do this for myself. I'm like demonstrating like hurting yourself. Like I can't do that. And he said, well, what would you do if you had to teach in person and you had this pain? And I said, oh, well, I would just teach from a chair. Like I don't have to demonstrate. I can just like verbally lead people and teach from a chair, and that would be okay in an in-person class. And he said, well, just do that. And I said, well, who's going to pay for an online yoga class of me just sitting in a chair talking to the camera? And he says, well, that's the class. That's the real class. That's what you're doing. So I went to do the online class that day, and I looked at the camera and I said, okay, listen, I'm in a lot of pain. I can't demonstrate. I understand if you want to unsubscribe, but this is the deal. And I just like taught the class from a chair. And sure enough, after that class, I got like dozen emails. A lot of them were other yoga teachers thanking me for modeling self-care. And I realized, wow, like maybe I don't need to demonstrate everything online either. And I do think Zoom made that better because is a bunch of people practicing, not just me on screen sitting in a chair. Even if I'm sitting in a chair, there's other people doing it like you're saying,
Yeah.
But it was a big moment for me. I was like, okay, just kind of do whatever you would do as a real teacher in person online. And I do think at this point it makes a lot of sense. It's pretty easy to set up a laptop in the back of the room. And I do think there's a production thing, which I did steal from Yoga Glow, which is I put the camera low just for, I know this is like an insider yoga teacher podcast. I think sometimes one of the mistakes that people make is they put the camera too high. That like milk crate high, like floor level is way better. And what I do is I basically make like a kind of row from the camera straight through to where I'm sitting and then put mats going off of that. So there's like a little center aisle that the camera looks down, and then you have students on either side of that, which is what the Yoga Glow formula was.
Yeah.
And then you just have to have you have to have decent lighting, you can't have too much backlight, and then you should be good to go,
Yeah, I know exactly what the Yoga Glow setup because
it makes it feel like you're down a little bit and you're like in the class more,
Yeah, definitely. So before, kind of going back, but before you became a yoga teacher or you started, like right when you started teaching, what were you doing before? Like what were you in the band? Like what was your, I guess, work job or source of income before you became a teacher?
Well, I mean, during college, I had like odd jobs, like worked at a bagel shop and like coffee shops and stuff. And I tried to be a waiter at one point, but I was really bad at it. And then I was basically like a starving musician for a little while.
Mhm.
And then really, to be totally real about it, for a long while, I was a marijuana delivery guy. So at that time in New York City, before the internet, I had a beeper, a phone beeper, and then I had a guy in college, and then I sort of started working for him. And so basically, I would ride around on my bike delivering weed to people I knew from college,
Mhm.
and I would make more than enough money for like a whole month in like 1 day or 2 days.
Mhm.
Because I had an apartment in the Lower East Side for $400 a month.
Mhm.
And that is essentially how I financed my yoga education. I mean, maybe that's a taboo thing to admit to, but
Mhm.
if I'm being totally honest, that's how it happened. I had like a 2-year period,
Mhm.
2-3-year period where I made more than enough money doing that, and it enabled me to just go to yoga classes every day,
Mhm.
sometimes like several.
And ever since then, like becoming a teacher, start teaching classes and becoming a studio owners, that ever
Yeah,
since
there was a
then.
moment where like I was making money as a teacher now, and I was like, I don't want to be the weed guy anymore. I want to be the yoga teacher. So I just let go of that. And at a certain point, I was making enough from teaching, and I have managed. I'm going to knock on something, and I have continued to pay my way teaching since.
Do you think it's more challenging now for teachers coming out of teacher training to become a full-time teacher than it was back then? Or do you think it was harder back then?
Oh, it's undoubtedly harder now.
I said.
I think that at that time, there was a lot more opportunities for people to make it work than there is now, you know?
Mm. But
I
there's
think,
more
yeah.
studios or more gyms that hire teachers now, but it's just more, I feel like it's maybe a lower paying opportunities now.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is even bigger than the yoga world. It's just like gentrification in general of certain cities and towns, and whether or not you can kind of have thriving artist communities in those places.
Mhm.
I think it's still possible. I mean, we talked about that when you came on my show. It's not like you can't. I know people who are doing it, so it's not like it doesn't happen.
Mhm.
But I think, as I said earlier, there was a lot more of a kind of organic way for people to go about it.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think there was a time in particular where I just remember it was booming and just people calling me for private classes all the time. And
Mhm.
I don't think that happens in the same way now.
Mhm.
So I think there's been a contraction to a lot. The pandemic really contracted things. What was like I was on the international travel circuit for a couple years. Like when I first moved here,
Mhm.
I was just doing online and traveling because I had the podcast. And so I had people inviting me. So I was going to all these different countries and stuff. And I was kind of there was like a circuit. And I would see all the other teachers, all the international yoga teacher trainers traveling around internationally.
Yeah.
I was never really like an A-lister. I was like a B-lister, but I was on the same circuit.
Yeah.
And that whole thing is gone, like
Oh.
gone. And I was talking to some people recently at the Berkshire Yoga Festival about it, just about like how much more difficult it is to try to do travel in general. So there's been a big contraction. What I will say is there's lots of people now like me opening this little yoga center that I opened almost a year ago, trying some things. Like I know somebody in London doing it as well, like opening a place called Home, like trying to like get back to certain things that we love about yoga that were like part of our experience that seem to have been set by the wayside. We're seeing if we can kind of bring them back in this new context.
Mhm.
It sort of remains to be seen how sick we can be at doing it.
Mhm. Yeah. I would, yeah, I feel like maybe before the pandemic, the yoga teachers teaching in different places and countries, and also like places like Yoga Works were huge. There's so many places.
They had like a central booking office and they were sending people all over.
the part of the reason I started this this podcast interviewing yoga teachers is that like we don't really have a path that's laid out for us as a yoga teachers, and all the teachers I get to speak to and share their journey found their own unique way to make yoga into what they love, into also their career. And so I just remember I thinking like, oh, yoga works must be the path. Like that you start going through the teacher training and you become their sub, and then you start teaching and then you become their teacher trainer. And there was this like path laid out, I felt like at the time. And then pandemic happened and like that crumbled. And now it's like, okay, everybody kind of have to make their own path. Like there's no one way to do it, to be a full-time teacher and to be able to continue doing what we love sustainably. And I think it's so fascinating that I get to speak to so many people like you who, everybody have their own unique path that they kind of made it work. And then some teachers are still traveling and teachings. And I know
they're out there, some people. I mean, definitely there's some people who are managing to still get some of that travel stuff going, but just not to the extent that it was.
Yeah. And even when it was, like I hear people talk about how it wasn't very sustainable when they're traveling so much.
That's what I was going to say. Even before the pandemic, there was some writing on the walls. Like I think a lot of people started to realize that like having to get the teacher training numbers every year, like go out and sell the training every year. Like that's why Annie, we talked about doing 200-hour trainings, and just like at a certain point, it started to just really sour. And so I think there was, and even on the circuit, you would go a couple years in a row. That first, second year, you'd have big groups, but the third year, there would always be like the lists got tired. You know what I mean? Only you couldn't keep it repeating again and again indefinitely. And I do think that there was already, like I said, some writing on the walls, and we were kind of saying, oh, I don't know if this is really on the upward trajectory.
Yeah.
But I do think there's also been a sort of distilling where at this point, if you want to really try to be a yoga teacher, you have to really care about it. Like, otherwise you would do it. Like, I do think we tried to make it into a more glamorous, like rock star thing at some point, as we discussed. But I think it's more like being an artist or a starving musician. Like, that's the reality of it. I mean, some people are certain. A few people manage to like fall into certain situations. Your yoga with Adrian or whatever, like certain things happen, certain stars align. And so someone's making six figures. They've got some yoga celebrity from the past that they can still ride on now, maybe. But generally speaking, most teachers are grinding it out. They're trying to make somewhere between $30,000 and $1,000 a year or something. And a lot of us, that's fine. We can actually make that work because we're living, as you said, when you came on my show, really modest lifestyles where we're not trying to get rich. We just want to be able, like you said, to do a thing that is meaningful to us and feels like it's helpful in the world rather than just like extracting value or whatever.
Yeah. I know that you offered teacher training online, and did you also offer in person when you had your studio in New York?
Yeah, that's interesting because I did a 200-hour training twice a year for about 7 years in Brooklyn. And I felt good about the program, but it definitely was the only way that the center was surviving, especially in those last few years. And it isn't a good model because if you totally rely on it and then this year the group is small, like last year you had 30 and this year you have 12, you're kind of not in a good spot, like you needed that money and it didn't come. So I don't know. I also really grew weary, as I discussed with Annie when she came on my show, with just the way that we put together these by-hour trainings, because it was all about asana. It was all about me demonstrating how to do asana. And at some point, when I left Brooklyn, I swore off doing teacher training ever again. And for a couple years there, I had one or two, actually three exactly, people who reached out to me and said, I want to study with you. How can I study with you? And those people, we did one-to-one mentorship where they just came and stayed with me at my house. And they would like stay for weekends at my house and would be with my family and eat dinner with me. And then we would go into my studio and stuff. And I did kind of come up with something about how I felt like I wanted to mentor people, or the ways that I felt good about what I have to teach in terms of like a teacher training.
Yeah.
And then during the pandemic, I did start like a weekly teacher sangha where I was having these meetings where we were doing stuff in there.
Yeah.
And at some point, I felt way more confident about it. I had weekly classes, like 4 or 5 weekly live classes. I had this weekly discussion group. And then when I really thought about it, I said, well, when I did in-person training, a lot of times what the sessions was I would give like an hour and a half presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't use PowerPoint, but I would give a bit of a lecture on whatever the topic was. And
Mm-hmm.
then we would have a discussion about that, whether we're talking about sutras or we're talking about Vedas or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, it didn't make sense to me to have everybody have to show up to live Zoom meetings to hear me give a lecture.
Mm-hmm.
So I set about for about a better part of a year during the pandemic, the very beginning of it, recording video of me talking, like taking what would have been these hour-long things and
Mm-hmm.
making them into 20-minute pieces
Mm-hmm.
and spreading them out. So 3 a month. The idea was 1 a week, 1 20-minute video a week for 3 weeks. And then the 4th week, we just play catch up open
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
and I kind of came up with an outline and all these module videos. And that basically became kind of the basic structure for an online teacher training that I started in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And I've felt really good about that. That's become like the online teaching that I really feel good about because I feel I've managed to find a way to use those tools that I feel good about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what I was gonna ask. I know I listened to the most recent episode you had of you and somebody discussing Yoga Alliance and the
Mhm.
new company that person created that's similar to Yoga Alliance.
Yes.
I feel like how do we create something or teach a teacher training in a way that feels true to you? Like you said, you're able to create something like that. And then also, I think a lot of teachers in studio or yoga schools have this pressure of like, have to make this amount of money to survive the business, and those two kind of conflict with each other. Like you really want to stay true to how you teach yoga teacher training and make it very meaningful, but then the pressure to have to make a certain amount of money. And that can
Yes,
be
it is a very real struggle that you're pointing to.
Mm.
I would say that conversation that I had on the show recently is an attempt to just sort of be more honest about what people are already doing, because there's kind of a bit of a myth or a sham around, the yoga teacher certifications and registrations. But really, and Annie and I talked about this, like individual teachers of themselves at a certain point, like, okay, I'm going to play ball with this. I'm going to jump through this hoop because people are looking for trainings that they feel are credible. And for some reason, they think this makes them credible, even if it doesn't. We're kind of playing by the rules. But in actuality, what's happening in the room, what people are doing between teachers and students, people like Annie who come from a deep, real, passionate place in their practice and their teaching, we still manage to do authentic work, even despite the stupidity of the 200-hour structures that we created, But I think a lot of folks also have felt more emboldened to do things the way they think is the right way to do them. I suppose that that is a generational thing. You asked me, does someone coming in nowadays have the same opportunities? And maybe they don't, at least until you're like a little bit later in your years or something, or you get to a place where, like even we discussed, where you have a little bit more of your own platform. You're probably going to have to play by some other people's rules for a while, I guess. Which is not what the spirit of yoga was not about playing by other people's rules.
I know I've seen teacher training program that does not offer, it's not accredited by Yoga Alliance. And, they're just offering something they created that they feel passionate and good about, but not necessarily are registered under Yoga Alliance. And I kind of like that and respect that. But I also know a lot of teachers or non-teachers who want to become teacher, like that logo of Yoga Alliance accredited is such a I don't know why it became such an important thing that people really
I mean, I've really tormented over this over the years.
Yeah.
And that business partner that I had that we were talking about before, he was really anti-Yoga Alliance because he was all about being an independent producer and he didn't think they were doing anything for me, and we fought about it. And I said to him, because I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that if I ever did want to do teacher training, the reality of it is like at least one person each year who signs up for my training, it was a determining factor for them. Like if they had to choose, they had 2 or 3 they were looking at, and 2 of them were registered and one of them wasn't. They're probably going to pick one of the ones that registered because people don't really know if it matters or not.
Yeah.
And it seems like, oh, that would be a good idea. And I just also didn't want people who's practiced with me to be at a disadvantage to other programs. But at the same time, it really doesn't matter. Like most places do not care.
Yeah.
And even the places that do, sometimes they don't know anything about the difference between registration or certification. So you can just show them your teacher certificate that you got from your training program and they'll take that. They don't know anything about Yoga Alliance or RYT.
Yeah, definitely. I have never been asked ever to show proof of that if I'm registered under Yoga Alliance. They asked for my certificate,
Yeah.
but never have I had a place ask me to prove that I was registered under Yoga Alliance. But I have heard of places who asked that.
I mean, well, the ironic thing is that during the pandemic, I produced a couple other more on-demand videos, like an online workshop and these practice videos. And I eventually did like register myself as like a continuing education professional as well through Yoga Alliance. And my business partner was smart about this and he made a point of listing all of them on the Yoga Alliance website. So in the last like 3 years or 4 years, got like a fair amount of referrals of people buying my videos for continuing education coming from the Yoga Alliance website. And I can see that in like the data.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, my business partner admitted, he's like, okay, you were right. Cause like that's the first time I've been registered for a long time. And it's only in the last 3 or 4 years that being registered with them really tangibly, you can see like being on that website is doing something for my business or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's very rare. Most of the time, that's not the case. And I was just talking with some other teachers recently, and almost everybody on the call was not registered and stopped seeing a need for it. So it's what it is.
I know you've been doing your podcast for many, many years. How many years now?
I'm just about to hit 10 years.
And
like 2 months. In 2 months, it'll be 10 years.
That's amazing. And you started way before anyone else. I'm sure maybe you were the first yoga podcast out there.
No, there was yoga podcasts, but they were like practice more, like people just doing classes on podcasts.
Okay.
But I was one of the first. I do think it was very close. I might have just started a little bit before her, but Andrea Ferretti did start Yoga Land right around a similar time as me.
Okay.
Although she hasn't kept it up in the same way that I have. But it was similar. There was that one. And then also Jacob Kyle had one, Chipped Heads, which was another podcast. I think they both started maybe just a little bit after me. I would have to really go check. But I wasn't the only one, but I was definitely one of the first.
Okay. I somehow thought that yours was first and Andrea's Yoga Land came after you. But yeah, both
that
of them
might
were
be true,
couple.
but it wasn't that long after is all I would say.
Okay. So what was your like intention for starting it? And also, I guess I'm coming from a place of me just starting it I started mine a year and a half ago. And then I'm finding it's a lot of work and obviously, but also like it's hard to see the return on investment at this point because it's still pretty new. So how have you found doing this for 10 years and how does it fit into your business and what have you been able to receive from, being so consistent, producing episodes once a week for 10 years? And like what kind of advice would you give to somebody like me who just started a year and a half ago? And I've been really good about being consistent. Every Monday I'm bringing it in.
Yeah.
But I know everybody says it's going to take a long time to like.
Yeah, I would say in terms of the role that it plays, I was like a blogger before I was the podcaster. So there was like before social media, there was the yoga blogosphere. There was a kind of a heyday, and I had a monthly blog that I wrote, 800 words a month, which was sort of like my social media before there was social media. And then social media came and everything went on to Facebook. And there was a time where it was still cool on Facebook and we had really interesting comment threads and you were still learning and engaging with each other and it was cool. And then at some point, it really started to sour. You could see like the algorithms shift and like it started to feel crappy. And I started to feel like people really weren't reading the blog in the same way. And it couldn't really get to any depth and nuance in 800 words the way I wanted. And I started listening to podcasts, specifically WTF with Mark Maron, actually. He's just ending his podcast right now after 15 years of doing his. But it was interesting because I really enjoyed it. Like I would think more, it would inspire me more. It felt like I was listening to like old radio on the internet and it would kind of got me off of looking at a screen. And I thought, I think that I could do that for like yoga. I think like having like long form conversations that are not scripted would be really cool. And so I jumped into it and I, at first, as you've learned, like there takes some learning, it's a weird thing to like get on a call with somebody you never met before, record yourselves and like try to say something smart or whatever, or like try to get a conversation going. And people are kind of sometimes coming with this idea of like an interview. So you're supposed to have all these questions prepared. And my whole idea is I don't want to write questions because yoga teachers all have scripts and I think that's good. And sometimes I want them to give their script, but I want to get us off the scripts because like if you and I just went to hang out and have tea, we would just talk,
Yeah.
And my idea was like, I want it to be like that on the show. And at the beginning, I would remember I would start recording and they didn't know I was recording. And then at some point in like 10 minutes in, they would say, if you listen to the early episodes, you'll hear this. It happened every time. They'd say, are we going to start? I'd say, oh yeah, we're starting. And they'd be like, what? And like, I loved that. It was my favorite moment because it showed that this was the real conversation we were having.
Yeah.
But at some point it actually became a problem because people had said things they didn't want people to hear, which I always thought was, no, that was awesome. That was the real you. So, but now you'll hear me, I say, I'm recording already, is that, it caused issues down the road, but that was the idea. And as I said to you earlier, it was literally like, I go to Eric Schiffman's website and there's a contact form and I say, hey, Eric Schiffman, one of my, inspirational teachers who I've never really gotten to study with, but it is awesome. You want to come on my show? And he like emailed me back within 30 minutes. Sure. And I was like, what? I learned eventually how to listen better. I really think, and I'm sure you're observing that if you record yourself and then you listen back, you see all kinds of things about yourself. You see like, oh man, you're interrupting all the time, and understanding, oh, well, why am I interrupting? Some of that was because I wanted to move the conversation along. I'm trying to be a podcast host. Some of that is because I'm not listening good. So it's helped me grow as a person a lot to do the podcast. And ultimately, it's just become my continuing education. Like I get to talk to people about the things that I want to learn about or that are interesting to me. I get to learn from people and ultimately, at this point, I feel like I've come to know what the process is for me. There's like a process that you develop. To your other point, it is a lot of work. I have figured out a way to kind of like dial it in and streamline a lot of things. But the only way that you can keep it going is if it continues to feel like interesting and creative for you. It's got to feel fun and it's got to be enjoyable. I genuinely like doing it. That's why I have no problem coming on here and just doing this with you for 2 hours. Because to me, in like the modern digital landscape, this is where I feel the most like, oh, this is feels vibrant and alive for me and you to try to connect
Mm-hmm.
as people and talk
Mhm.
about stuff that's important to us.
Yeah.
And I would also say part of my show, I know you do your like solo episodes where you share a little bit about more. For me, from the very beginning, I've been doing these intros and outros
Mm-hmm.
because it started, I mentioned I was like in massive pain,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, looking at Instagram, and there's always like hashtag yoga every damn day, and everybody's looking beautiful on the beach. And I know teachers getting hip replacements and stuff, and I'm in massive pain. And I was like going on the podcast and recording these intros late at night, just like crying, being like, I'm in so much pain. And it was part of like trying to like tear down some of this like edifice of like what a yoga teacher is and what they're like,
Mm-hmm.
So I never forget, like, the first time I had Judith Hanson-Lassiter on,
Yeah.
she was like this big time teacher, and I was like totally messed up, and I like did this intro, and I was like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't do this, and if you want to skip ahead, you can, but I was like just kind of going through it,
Yeah.
So for me, the podcast has been like incredibly therapeutic because it's a place where I really am transparent, and I just talk into the mic like I would talk to my best friend.
Mm-hmm.
As much as I can. And that's been good in terms of business because people have connected. It did replace my social media. At some point for a while, I was still posting out on all my social media accounts every time a new podcast episode came out. This week on the podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that business partner of mine, he at some point said, you know what? I don't think that's doing anything for you. Let's do an experiment and see. So what we did is we just stopped doing, first we stopped doing Facebook posts and we watched the download numbers to see if they changed. No change. Then we stopped doing the Instagram posts. No change. Then we stopped doing the Twitter posts. No change. We stopped doing all posts. No change to download numbers, but we saw an increase in email subscribers and sales.
Wow.
And then that was, gosh, a lot of years ago, 10 years ago almost now, 9 years ago. And I still have the accounts. And sometimes these days, like if you post something and you tag me, I'll repost it. But I don't comment and I don't make posts anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the podcast, to your question, is my social media.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I connect with the broader internet world.
Yeah. That's so, I knew that you don't really use social media. Like you said, you have an account, but you don't really use it. And but you have a, really big, probably community of people really following you through the past 10 years on the podcast. But that's been so eye-opening. And also, I think it's great because I think nowadays teachers feel like they have to have Instagram, they have to have this, and they have to have this and this, and they feel like they have to have all these things. And I do have my I use Instagram for promoting or just sharing, but I tell people like there are amazing yoga teachers out there who don't use social media and they're still like doing great. Like, they still are teaching, they still have great student base. And so I don't think it's the only way, and it's not it doesn't have to be a must. And I think you are the great example of that.
Well, I would say, just to be clear, I like in the spirit of transparency, because you said, you probably have a really big following through your podcast. The actual number is probably around 4,000 people. Just to be clear, there's probably about 4,000 people who listen pretty regular to the podcast. I think people come in and out, but somewhere in and around there is the number. I have more than that, like maybe 5,800 Instagram followers or something like that. But if I were to post something on Instagram, only a very small percentage of those followers would probably see it, and there's no way to know.
Yeah.
But with the podcast and, my email list is about the same, like that, those are like more tangible. And it goes back to what you said earlier about 1,000 true fans. It is like a philosophy where if you're going to be an independent creator and you're not going to have like some grow and scale up and become some big thing or whatever, you need 1,000 true fans. And I didn't invent that. People can go Google that. But if you have, in theory, 1,000 people on the planet who really care about what you do and will buy your stuff, and you put out $100 worth of stuff each year, you can make a living off of that. And that has been proven true. The numbers can vary. Like it could be, 2,000 people at $50 a year or 4,000 people at $25 a year,
Yeah.
But it can be a small group of people that sustain you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the goal is to really stay true to what those people are interested in, the value that you're bringing to those people, rather than trying to like grow it and get bigger and have more reach. And social media is about reach. And if you're kind of going from scratch, like it makes sense for you to use it. But the wise thing, you asked me if I had any advice. The wise thing is to have a base, maybe a website. Ideally, I know you do. And you want to think of it as like all the other things you're doing want to funnel people there. You don't want what you do to live on Instagram or Facebook. People have learned the hard way that can like kind of just go away in a second and you don't have any control over it or whatever. So like what me and Josh used to call it was owning your own digital landscape so that you get everything to point to where your offerings are that you want to point people to.
Yeah.
And in terms of podcasting, it really is just about consistency. You just got to stick it out. It's like teaching yoga in a way too. You got to stick it out and keep at it. And it's, again, I think podcasting is like yoga teaching too. There was a little bit more of a heyday, and nowadays it's like any art. You just got to stick to it, and you got to do it because it's fulfilling for you. And then hopefully, other people get turned on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Coming from 10 years of experience.
I think I just make a ritual of it. It's just you kind of make it part of your practice to do this thing, and it keeps me on my toes and creative and having to be present and to learn. It keeps me challenging myself to keep learning,
Yeah. And you have so many amazing guests on your shows but I also love the variety, because you might have somebody who's a very famous yoga teacher, but then you have somebody like, who just became a yoga teacher a couple years ago who came on. I remember listening to one of those episodes. So I just love the variety. And I think people can tell that you are very, in your intro and outro, you're really, sharing as a very authentic.
Yeah, sometimes too much, baby.
And I think that's how people can feel like they're relatable. People can feel like you're like a real human. It's not somebody.
Well, it's interesting what you say about like larger name teachers or like newer teachers. I did discover at some point that sometimes, just because they're a big name teacher doesn't always make for the best episode, because especially if they come thinking of it as an interview and they're not like really trying to connect with me. But like sometimes I'll do things where like someone, like a listener, will send me an email. I just think it's a cool email and I'll be like, hey, let's record a podcast. And those are sometimes the best because they listen to this show and they love the show and they want to come on and connect with me. And, I found that if you really connect with somebody and you have like mutual passions, like it almost always leads to like a good talk,
Yeah.
Very rarely have I had a talk that I was like, and even those ones, sometimes the ones that I was like, I don't think that was very good. Somebody emailed me and thought it was like their favorite one. And I was like, what? So, you never know what people are going to like.
That's very true. Another question I wanted to ask you about, you recently started teaching at, I don't know if this is a right, was it a juvenile hall or was it a foster care home? You started teaching at a new location, and I want to hear how's that teaching going.
Thank you for asking about that. That's really new. Like literally last month, I started that. And it was funny, I was talking on the show with somebody named Mike Huggins, who had something called the Transformation Yoga Project, which was bringing yoga into prisons. And he was kind of talking about that sector being like an area where like a lot of those programs used to struggle to get funding, and they're not struggling as much because like the prisons want it in a way that they didn't previously. And I was like, wow, isn't that interesting? And I was like, wow. And in the past, honestly, I never really wanted to do that. Like, I didn't want to go to hospitals or detention centers. Like, just wasn't my jam, really. But I don't know. I had that conversation with Mike, and things have just felt so contracted in general. And then out of nowhere, I got a call from this local organization called the Shanti Project. And I knew them from they do like mindfulness yoga stuff for kids in elementary schools, but I didn't know they also do stuff in juvenile detention centers. So they were looking for specifically a male teacher because the boys were requesting that. Apparently they do these surveys and the boys in the detention center were like, aren't there any male yoga teachers? Because they were all women. So they were kind of on the hunt for a male yoga teacher and someone dropped my name. And I don't know, the stars sort of aligned and I just said, oh, I think I'm supposed to do this. And it's been really an intense, it's not like a glamorous, gig. It's like these kids are in prison and they're just kids. And at the same time, I don't know, it's been very rewarding to do it. And I've been like chanting in the prison, which is just cool. And in a way, I don't know, so far, I've been really liking doing it. It is challenging, but at the same time, it's strange how much more I think I'm probably more comfortable teaching in a juvenile detention center than I would be at like one of those boutique fitness places that you teach at in Los Angeles, because I don't come up against the hot class next door, They're just grateful. Like these boys, I don't think they've ever even met somebody like me or whatever who like chants and does yoga, So I don't know. It's been pretty cool, and I feel grateful for the opportunity.
And all the boys who come take your class, they're very like responsive, like they want to be there, they want to learn, or is some of them not interested at all?
They do have to go. It is required. But most of them, there's like 2 pods. A pod is like, it's like a common room and then like all these bedrooms off of it. And I do 2 different pods. And pod 1, they're into it. I got three boys in that pod. I've gone like 4 or 5 weeks in a row now. They're down. They're into it. So they're kind of showing up to practice and they're kind of like asking me some questions now. That's starting to feel really cool. The other pod is way more challenging because the kids just don't have very good attention spans. And so they're kind of all over the place. And so it's a little bit harder to get it going with them. But so far, so good. Again, it is a very challenging situation, but it's amazing how yoga really is a powerful tool and it can kind of transcend even what would seemingly be like a very big environmental obstacle. So, yeah, it feels good. I mean, and also to be frank, it's some guaranteed money. It's not like a lot, but it's good enough where it made sense for me to do it. It fit in my schedule. I didn't have to change anything, so yeah, I'm glad for it.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm sure the boys who are actually interested in enjoying it, I'm sure it's going to have a positive influence or impact, especially if they're, like you said, they have never met somebody like you before. Like, I think it could open up a whole, perspective or world when you can meet somebody that's like, you just never knew this kind of thing existed.
Yeah, I'd like to think it would plant some potentially positive seeds.
Yeah, definitely. So I have one more question before we close out, or, before the closing questions. You have said very in the beginning about the Jivamukti place center that you're practicing at. Teacher training made it a requirement that students have to go to kirtan, and that made many teachers leave because maybe they started to feel like it was cultish. And I had a very similar experience. I worked at a studio that had a strong affiliation with Hare Krishna temple, and they made kirtan as part of the requirement for 200-hour teacher training. And I always never really felt right about that. So I was interested that, what you shared kind of was similar to some of the experience I had. So was when people left, when they realized it was requirement, is it because they felt like it was becoming too like religious, or what was that reason?
I don't know if I would say, well, maybe the short answer would be yes to your question, but I think that it happened across the yoga world where things started out at a certain scale, little storefront apartments in the East Village. And then basically, as I discussed with Amy when she came on the show, Madonna and Sting showed up to class. And then suddenly all the classes were sold out and people assumed leadership roles and were also put up on pedestals. And I think that at some point it lost its like feel of like everybody could do their own thing. And now people had to kind of be following along with what the people who owned the place wanted more.
Mm-hmm.
And those people who had their own kind of unique thing, like Leslie and Allison,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't feel comfortable having to be under that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because it didn't start out as that. It started out as like everybody, you could get all kinds of different classes there
Mm-hmm.
because people were just bringing in whatever their practice was, whatever they were learning.
Yeah.
So I think that happened across a lot of things, even just when you look at like Ashtanga Vinyasa and you talk to people who like Amy practiced when there was like 12 people in the room as opposed to like 600 people at the Puck building.
Mm-hmm.
Or even Iyengar method where I talked to people who said they did jump backs with Iyengar. And you're like, what? That nobody would ever conceive of such a thing. That there was a time where things weren't so codified and standardized and things were a little bit more open and free. And then at some point, as it got bigger and there was more money being made, people really sort of standardized things more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of what's the return these days is back to like me opening a little teeny studio for that fits 8 to 10 people max.
Yeah.
And the idea is if you could just get the overhead low enough,
Mm-hmm.
you don't need that many people and you can have like a community practice again. It's not like going to the gym or something, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely. I really hope and starting to see a little bit more of and really want to believe that this the little small places that's starting to pop up a little bit more now.
Yeah.
It'll be nice to see those places do well and
I don't
survive.
know. I'm not going to lie. I've been open for 9 months and it's not been terrible, but it's not been great. It's definitely a challenge and I'm having to like face some pretty hard decisions at some point, you know. You can find ways to make it work. I do have online stuff to kind of support it as well, but still at a certain point, if it's not bringing in enough money, you have to question whether you can keep it. But at this point, I'm still managing to make it work and I'm holding some hope because I would, like you, like for a place like this to be able to exist, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's more reason than ever before for a place like this to exist. Whether or not people hold value for it is another question because as you discussed when you came on my show, the way people are kind of engaging with buying memberships at whatever studio, it's not always easy to compete. So we'll see. It remains to be seen.
Yes. Well, I'll be rooting for you from the back.
Thank you, Reika. Thank you.
And what kind of kind of in this topic of, the small studios trying to do it in the way that feels very true to you, what are some influence or impact that you wish you want to have in the yoga world as of now that, it has gone through quite some change and where it is right now? Like, what do you wish you can have? What kind of influence or impact you can have?
Oh, gosh, I don't know that I really have an idea for that. I don't know that I have an idea about how I want to influence the yoga world. I think that my yoga practice and teaching is just, it is like a spiritual path or it is like my way of being in the world or how one of the things that I've found to help me be in the world. So I don't know. It's more of like a spiritual thing for me to be at it. And I don't, as much as I kind of geek out on it and I like to kind of analyze the yoga industry and the world of it, I don't have any idea about what I'm trying to do on it or say. And I think I am wanting to represent a certain honesty or people who, like, I've talked to so many people who, whatever, they had some experience in Shavasana or whatever, that first yoga class, and then it's just become something super important in their lives.
Yeah.
And from all walks of life and all places in the world. And I find that so intriguing and amazing. So for me, I think I'm more and more, I'm trying to serve whatever I feel is that higher power. I mean, it's a little taboo of a thing to talk about sometimes in the yoga world. I've tried to talk about it more on my show recently because just in my latter years, I turned 53 this year. You know, faith and like belief in a higher power has probably been the most important thing. And I really do think at this point, I'm trying to serve that in what I'm doing, anything I'm doing. And I've told the Lord that if He wants me to do something different, I will do something different. If it means like not having the podcast anymore and not having a yoga center and just like go getting some job to support my family, I will do that. Like as much as I love it and it's become part of my identity, I feel really strongly that I can't cling to it. There's a lot of ego involved in being so bold as to be like, I'm going to have a show and I'm going to have everybody listen to me. Like there's a certain, even being a yoga teacher, getting up in front of a bunch of people and everybody's facing this way and you're facing that way. There's a certain, you need that. There's a certain ego and charisma that goes with it. That's good. It's not all negative.
Yeah.
But like to keep that in check, I think I've seen teachers before me fall into the traps of that as we're discussing, you know. So for me, doing the podcast and being oversharing and all that is a way for me to kind of hold myself to account and to try to model something about earnest people in the world who care about yoga.
Love it. Thank you. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. But I want you to maybe share with the listeners who is listening how they can find you or anything upcoming, anything you want to share with them, feel free to share.
Sure. I don't know when this will go out, but I do. If you want to listen to the podcast, you can find J.Brown Yoga Talks wherever you listen to podcasts. Or if you want to find all my stuff, I do have ongoing live classes and weekly discussion group and on-demand videos. You know, those module videos that I mentioned as part of my training, you can actually get those just as like an on-demand course without doing teacher training for a lot less money. So if people wanted to watch those videos, they're there. All of that is at jbrownyoga.com. You can find everything at that site.
Thank you so much, Jay, for this time that I get to have this conversation with you. Anything I missed, any question I didn't ask that you want to share?
No, I think it's cool that you're doing it. Hang in there. Just keep at it. As I said to you when you came on my show, whenever I've listened to a lot of podcasts and I've been on podcasts and you know, you did a great job with Amy and like helped me prepare to have her on my podcast. So you've got something to what you're doing, and I would encourage you to keep at it. And like you said, in terms of the payoff, here's what I would say. I have managed, at one point I ran ads and I did make money off of that, but I stopped doing that because that sucks. And you don't want to do the programmatic ads. If you can stay away from that ad insertion, stay away from it.
Okay.
But what I did do was I did create like a podcast premium subscription where, because I have a large archive, I made the archive first half free. So you can listen to the first half of the episode free, everybody. But if you are a podcast premium subscriber, you get all the full length episodes. And that has been a way to bring in a bit of money from the podcast. But more than anything, people are going to listen to the podcast. They're going to connect with you. And then that's going to bring people to all the other things that you do. So it's like social media in that regard. It's possible to make some money off of it, but more than anything, like when people come to an event, I was at a yoga festival a couple of weeks ago, they come up and they say, I've listened to your show every week for the last 4 years. You know, like that, you don't get that from other things. Like podcasting, like longer form podcasting is a real like way to connect. It's one of the last apps that cuts through like all the, 20-second blurbs or whatever. So there is a real value if you stick to it where you can form relationship to listeners. And that really does benefit all the things that you might do as a teacher,
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate your time. And this has been a great conversation.
Well, very cool. Let's be in touch. Please consider me a resource, okay?
Okay.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation I had with Jay. It was a pleasure to have a long conversation with him. I really enjoy speaking to him. And I hope you could tell how honest and genuine and real our conversations were. And I also hope you go listen to his podcast. He has some amazing conversations on his podcast, and he is a great resource for sure. Before we wrap up for this week, I do want to say that my dream retreat, coming to reality, ethical retreat in Nicaragua, have one room left. That's from July 12th through the 19th. You can still join if you like. And upcoming workshop of end of July, I have AJ, who is a doctor of physical therapy and a yoga teacher, coming to teach a workshop on teaching yoga for healthy aging. And this is going to be in-person workshop here in Long Beach if you're local, or you can join via live stream, or you can watch the recording later. AJ is being super generous. This workshop is sliding scale of $10 to $60, $10 to $60. You get to decide the amount you want to pay, and you will get 2 hours towards your continuing education with Yoga Alliance. So that's an exciting workshop coming up end of July. And I think that's it. If you enjoyed this conversation, this episode, or this podcast in general, it means a lot to me if you can leave me a review or 5-star on wherever you listen to this podcast from. But most importantly, more than reviews, what would mean so much to me is if you could share this podcast or this episode to your friends, to your yoga teachers, or maybe share it on your social media so more people can find it. As always, you can always message me on my Instagram at Reika Yoga, or you can message me through my website www.reikayoga.com, or join my newsletter so you get new moon and full moon newsletters sent to you every 2 weeks, where I share a little insights or inspirations, free online yoga class, and a little bit of new or full moon reflections and journal prompts that I create. So if you like to join my newsletter, the link is on the show notes as well. That is it for me this week, and talk to you next week.